Hey guys, today we're going to talk about nutrition in ecosystems and how energy enters a system and how it flows through. So I want you to take just a minute to think about that. How does energy enter a system? And then think about how it moves in a system. Also consider, does energy exit a system? And if so, how? In ecosystems, there's basically two categories of nutrition. The first category of nutrition or mode of nutrition is called an autotroph. An autotroph is a self-feeder or a producer, and we'll, for the most part, refer to it as a producer. But a self-feeder or producer is, in general, a green plant or something that's able to feed itself through photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a process in which inorganic molecules are converted to organic molecules using energy from the sun, and then are made available to other organisms. And so autotrophs, of course, are those that undergo photosynthesis. However, I want you to keep in mind with the example I have showing here that some organisms can be both photosynthetic and carnivores or consumers. The second category of nutrition is heterotroph, and a heterotroph is basically other nutrition or a consumer, something that must ingest existing nutrients and is pretty much reliant either directly or indirectly on producers, on autotrophs. So a consumer, like I said, an organism that ingests living or recently killed organic matter. We can have a couple of categories of consumer, including herbivore, which is a consumer that only consumes producers, or we can have carnivore, which is a consumer that only consumes other consumers, or we actually have a third category called an omnivore, which can consume plant matter and other animal matter. In addition to these, we've got some interesting modes of nutrition that we don't often think about, and one is called a detritivore. This is a type of decomposer, and it's an organism that ingests dead organic matter or fecal matter, and the job of a detritivore is to play a part in the decomposition cycle and to help to return nutrients to the soil that have been locked up in that organism. Additionally, we have organisms called saprotrophs, and saprotrophs live on or in dead organic matter, and they digest in a really interesting way. They actually, instead of bringing the raw material into their bodies and digesting it there, they actually secrete digestive enzymes. Digestion occurs outside of the body, and then they are able to absorb the digested products. And again, these are really, really important for the mineral and nutrient cycle of returning minerals and nutrients back to the soil to be used by producers in the future. Alright, so we're going to focus pretty heavily on energy right now rather than nutrients for the moment. So in almost every ecosystem, there has to be an initial source of light energy. Okay, for most ecosystems, light is the initial energy source. And what it does is it allows producers to convert those inorganic molecules to organic molecules that can then be passed on. Now, it's important to note that a lot of the light energy that actually enters an ecosystem is not retained. A lot of it is reflected or transmitted, and some is lost through heat energy. In addition, we have to think about those biomes, those ecosystems that have no access to light. If we think about cave systems, actually those kind of do have access to light because organisms can come and go into the light to bring that energy in. But there are some deep sea ecosystems that truly have no access to sunlight, and so they are able to harness that initial energy source from a chemical source, which we'll talk more about. Okay, so we have a couple ways of organizing our nutrition in an ecosystem, and one of those ways is by producing a food chain. And a food chain represents a feeding relationship in which a carnivore eats an herbivore, which itself has eaten plant matter. And there could be a couple of other steps in between, but as you can see on my example here, we've got energy entering from the sun, going to this grass. The grass is eaten by this grasshopper, eaten by a frog, eaten by a snake, eaten by a bird. Okay? So we see this whole energy flow through the system. And food chains are a nice, simple way of representing that. In addition to food chains, we can also produce something called a food web, which is an interconnection of many food chains, and there's often a lot of crossing over. Most organisms don't just eat one thing, and so lots of different food chains are going to interconnect into this food web. They're constantly changing. They're pretty temporal depending on, migration patterns or population sizes or whatever else. Availability of nutrients is an ever-changing thing. So as you can see here, we've got, probably like an Arctic Ocean type food web represented here, and you're able to see all of the interconnections and all of the feeding relationships. One note that I want you to make is that when we look at these arrows, it's pointing to energy flow. Okay, so what this means is that the smaller toothed whale is eating the baleen whale, and so energy is flowing from the baleen whale to the smaller toothed whale. Okay, so the arrows are always pointing in the direction of energy flow. Within a food web, we are actually able to assign something called trophic levels to the organism in that food web, and it helps us to keep things organized. And so a trophic level, again, we're talking about the flow of energy. So as you can see here, each red arrow is pointing to the organism that the energy is flowing to. So basically, the trophic level is representing how many times has the energy been transferred. So if we start with our producer here, the energy has been transferred one time. It's been transferred from the sun to this producer. And so this producer is representing a trophic level of 1. Okay, the energy has been transferred one time. From there, whatever organisms eat this producer, let's say we go here, this will represent a trophic level of 2, this herbivore. A trophic level of 2, because now the energy has been transferred from the sun to the plant, and from the plant to this larva. Okay, and this can go so on and so forth. It'll just keep going up and up and up as energy gets transferred from one organism to the next. There's an additional method for identifying these organisms as well, and it's very, very similar to the trophic level system with just one slight adjustment. Instead of putting the plant at trophic level 1, instead you would call it the producer, and then this first eater would be the primary consumer. The primary consumer. So instead of being trophic level 1, trophic level 2, we would go producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. So those are kind of the two methods that you might see for assigning level. In addition, it's important to keep in mind that one organism could occupy more than one level depending on what it eats. For example, if this is trophic level 1 with the plant, then this mouse could be 1, 2, 3, or if we take a longer path, it could be 1, 2, 3, 4. So each organism could occupy a different trophic level as well. Alright, lastly, we just need to discuss that this transfer of energy from one organism to another is never 100% efficient. In fact, it's fairly inefficient by the time an organism uses the energy that it's consumed to be active, to digest. Some of the energy is lost through undigested particles, etc. So energy that's transferred from one organism to the other is usually only about 10% of the energy that was originally consumed. And so there is a limit to how many times this energy can be passed from organism to organism, and that keeps food chains short, because once you get to those higher organisms, there's not a lot of energy left, which is why they often need to eat very large or very numerous other organisms to get the energy that they need to support their larger bodies. The way we represent this loss of energy is through something called a pyramid of energy, and it depicts how energy enters a system and then how it's leaving a system. And it's represented in general, this one is joules per meter squared per year, but in general it's going to be kilojoules per meter squared per year. So we see that we've got a lot of energy entering via sunlight, and then as we move through our food chain, it's lost in great amounts, losing about 90% per pass of what's remaining. So this is how we're going to represent that energy flow, and we will practice this in class when you guys get back. And please be thinking about questions and other information that you need to understand this. Thanks.